And hello, my fabulous students. This is your favorite teacher, Mr. Jacobson. I am excited to be with you today. Today, we are going to talk about the causes of the American Revolution. So, last time we talked about the 7 Years' War, and we're going to look how the effects of the 7 Years' War and Britain's new policies towards the American colonies as a result are going to eventually lead to revolution. So, exciting times. We're about to see the kind of the climax of everything happen in this story with the revolution. So let us begin. All right. So last we talked, we right at the end we learned about the Proclamation of 1763, and that's the proclamation that basically told the colonists that although you guys won the war, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, um, that you guys can't move past the Appalachian Mountains, which pretty much is this line in the picture here. And colonists were like, "That's crap. That's not cool. We helped fight this war, and all the land that was gained from France." So there was some major issues going on there, and the colonies felt like the British were sort of stripping them of their liberties, and just didn't have the right to ask that of them. So colonists pointed out that they could not directly elect representatives to Parliament, and they said this isn't okay because you guys are taxing us and you guys are passing laws against us, and we don't even have proper representation, right? It's the whole no taxation without representation thing. So the British responded that the colonists, like all British citizens, had virtual representation in government. So basically, their argument is all the members of parliament represent the interest of the entire empire, not just the small district that chose them. So basically their cop out is, you know what, parliament's always making decisions, based on the whole empire as a whole. So shut up, basically, and that's not going to go well either. So the colonists are going to become more resistant, and as they become more resistant, Britain's going to feel like they need to keep, showing who's boss, basically, and keeping that hold on them. So in the first 2 years of the proclamation, Parliament's going to pass three measures. You got the Sugar Act of 1764. And this act, they're going to tax sugar and other luxury goods. They're going to try to basically regulate the trade that were imposed upon the Navigation Acts, and they're going to become stricter in enforcing the Navigation Acts. So this whole salutary neglect is kind of going to go away after the 7 Years' War. Britain needs money, and these colonists are not staying in line to what they want, so they need to flex their muscle a little bit. Those accused of smuggling were tried in a admiralty courts um, by the crown, and that was appointed by judges without a jury. So they didn't get judged by their peers on some of these things, which they felt that was a violation of the rights as well. And then you have the Quartering Act, which happens, and the Quartering Act is basically colonists are going to be required to provide food and living quarters to the British soldiers and colonies. In particular, colonies at this point. Eventually, it's going to become all colonies towards the end. And you have the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act is different from these other acts we talked about. One, it's a direct tax, right? So you're directly being taxed on legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, advertisements. Um, and because this is a direct tax, uh, it was collect. The people could it hurt if it was bad because the people could see that they had to directly pay for this new stamp act tax. Whereas before, the merchants, um, they would just raise their prices on their goods, and so it wasn't like a direct tax that the people could discern. Um, so the Stamp Act was a big red flag for Americans because they felt like this was again this was them getting picked on and they didn't have any representation at Parliament to say, don't do this anymore. Let's vote against this. So, what are the reactions we see? Well, Patrick Henry, who's a Virginia lawyer, he speaks in the House of Burgesses to demand the king's government recognize the rights of all citizens, including the right to not be taxed without representation. So here we go with the whole no taxation without representation. As an act of resistance, the Stamp Act Congress was formed, and what we're going to start seeing is they're going to kind of say, no, we want representatives from the colonies, and we're going to determine that only elected officials have the legal authority to prove taxes. So they want the same rights as regular British citizens have. And the British are saying, you're not regular British citizens, you are somehow lower because you guys are from the colonies. And that's kind of where the disconnect is, right? Because the colonials have had that salutary neglect where they haven't really had to rely too much on Britain, and Britain wasn't having this watchful eye on them for so long, and now it's like all getting they're getting scrutinized, and they're getting less and less freedoms after the 7 Years' War, where they kind of felt like they won, and there should be more freedoms, right? So you have the Sons and Daughters of Liberty that start forming. This is a secret society, and they're going to intimidate tax agents. They're going to destroy revenue stamps, tar and feathered officials, which will become a common theme as well. However, boycotts against British imports were the most successful for enacting change. For example, instead of buying British cloth, American women would just proudly make their own clothes. And again, it just shows the resolve of the colonies, and especially at this point, the women, right? If people are not happy, and they're gonna find a way to boycott and hurt the other group and let them know that it's not working for them and they want change. And the wallet or the pocketbook is always a good place to go. So this is going to hurt the London merchants, these boycotts. And the London merchants are going to put pressure on Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. So you also have the Declaratory Act to save face from the Stamp Act, which is going to now be repealed because it's hurting merchants and the economy. Parliament's going to declare, well, we still have the right to tax you because we're the mother country, and so there. So the Declaratory Act is basically, okay, we'll take away the Stamp Act, but we will tax you if we want to, jerks. So the British government still needed revenue, so they passed the Townshend Acts now. So now we have a whole other set of taxes. So we have taxes from the colonial imports of like tea, glass, paper. The money would be used to pay the crown officials in the colony, make them independent to colonial assemblies that they had previously paid their salaries. So the colonies would pay the salaries of the um, of the officials, and now they're kind of taking that power away from the colonies, which they're not going to be happy with, right? There was also another act passed that permitted officials to search private homes for smuggled goods, and this was more of a blanket search. So all they had to get was a writ of assistance, and that allowed them to search pretty much anywhere. Um, Specifically when you get even today, when you get um, a um, a warrant to be able to search someone's house, you're searching for something specific. You don't just basically get to go through the whole person's house and say, oh, we'll just look through everything. That's caused a lot of trouble, especially in recent news with the Mar-a-Lago raid that happened. So uh, again, the whole freedoms that the colonists were enjoying, they're slowly being kind of trapped, and they're losing them, and they're not reacting very nicely to it. You have John Dickinson, who wrote the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, and basically what he's telling them is that we have the right to assemble, we have the right to representatives, and if you violate those laws, you're essentially violating the basic essential principles of English law itself. And then in 1768, you got John James Otis and Samuel Adams, and they wrote the circular letter. And basically, they sent copies to all over to other colonies and to their legislators, saying, "Look, tell Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. Let's start putting, let's start letting them know that we're not okay with this." Now, British officials in Boston did not like that the circular letter was being used to sort of usurp laws in Britain, and so they started to dissolve the legislature and increase the number of British troops. So this led to more boycotts and by the colonists that increased the tensions with all of them. So can you sort of see this slowly, and it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse with everything Britain's doing and the way the colonists are responding to it? So the Townshend Act will be repealed. There's going to be a new prime minister for the parliament, and his name's going to be Lord Frederick North. And he's going to say, you know what, this isn't really helping us. I mean, the Townshend Acts are not giving us a whole lot of money, and it's pissing the colonials off. So they're going to eventually decide to repeal it, okay? And after they repeal it, the colonists are going to be relatively mild and well mannered, except for the Boston Massacre, which we're going to talk about in the next slide here. So most Bostonians, they resented the British soldiers who quartered in their city to protect customs officials from attacks from the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. So, on a snowy day in March of 1770, a crowd of colonists harassed the guards near the customs house. The guards fired into the crowd, killing 5 people. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a dock worker that was a mix of African and Native American heritage. And Crispus Attucks is going to be used throughout other parts in history, in American history. So don't forget that name. So the troops that fired the shots were represented by a lawyer named John Adams, and they were acquitted of murder. However, they were found with manslaughter. Samuel Adams, the cousin of John Adams, called the incident a massacre, and during it, he tried to use it to inflame anti-British sentiment, and it's still called the Boston Massacre today. So apparently, he was successful in that. So resistance to British policies. So we're seeing the Committee of Correspondence happening. We have Samuel Adams. We have committees that are starting to come together. They're starting to exchange letters and try to share. They see that all these British activities happening, it's a threat to their way of life and to their freedoms. You have the Gatsby that happens here. So again, we have more letters coming. The Gatsby was a British customs ship that caught many smugglers. And we have colonists who don't like that they're catching these smugglers, because the smugglers is a way for them to sort of show defiance in the British taxes and regulations are being made. So they're going to set that ship afire. And then you have the Boston Tea Party, where you got so the British East India Company Parliament passes an act called the Tea Act, in which they were taxing tea to the colonials. And although the tea was, I guess, cheaper than Dutch tea, the it didn't matter to the colonists, because what they saw wasn't necessarily the price of the tea. It was the fact that they were taxing the tea, and they felt like they had a right to do that. So a lot of people from colonies, most likely, sons and daughters of the Revolution, um, you have people dressing up in like American Indian garb, and they're gonna come in, they're gonna dump the tea over the harbor, and they're gonna basically make that as their stance of, we don't accept this. Remember, they couldn't buy any other tea but British tea, so it just if you felt like there's only one place you could go shopping, basically, and that was a law, you could only go to, Kroger's or whatever, you'd probably be pretty pissed too, right? So it's the principle that the colonists felt about this whole thing. And many people, applauded this as the defense of liberty, and some people said, you destroy private property, that's a little too far for me. So then after this, you have the Intolerable Acts, and the acts are getting worse and worse, right? And so you have coercive acts of 1774 that come about. You have port acts where they're basically prohibiting trade at the port of Boston now. You have in Massachusetts the Massachusetts Government Act, which is going to reduce the power of the legislator in Massachusetts and give it mostly to the royal governor. You have the Administration of Justice Acts, which allow royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Great Britain instead of the colonies. So now even people who commit crimes in the colonies, they don't even get to have a say in what happens to them. And then you have the Quartering Act that's going to like become worse, and it's going to be on all the colonies instead of just few. And it's really starting to get out of hand here, as you can kind of see the escalation happening. Now with the with the Quebec Act, you have the British who are basically saying, okay, well, we acknowledge Quebec and even the Roman Catholicism as your official religion, um, and they're going to give them the boundary all the way down to the Ohio River, which again is kind of a slap in the face because the colonists worked so hard during the 7 Years' War to kind of to free it from France, and now they're giving a lot of it to Quebec. So this isn't a really good situation. It's almost like the British are really trying to try hard to piss them off or at least show their dominance. Here's a picture of the colonists, or the colonists would be this gal here. I believe it's a gal, and the others here who are pouring tea down their throat and forcing them, and they're holding her down or whatever. And that's kind of how the colonists felt, was they were just being forced all these things. They didn't have a say, didn't get any representation. There's a strong demand for justice that's happening. Supporters of the British response included many wealthy merchants in New York and Philadelphia, and planters in southern colonies are arising. So the most of the people that supported the British were the wealthy for the most part, right? They had the most to probably lose. However, the people that supported the Patriots, they were people that were, small farmers, and not all of them. Some of them were wealthy. In fact, George Washington is considered likely the most wealthiest of all the colonists at that time period, and he was in favor of independence. But a lot of the people who are loyalists, they're the ones who have the most ties to Britain, have the most to lose, typically. Um, and so, as violence increased, enough people were willing to speak out publicly, participate in mass protests, donate money, and you're starting to see more and more divides happen. And then you have, all these Enlightenment ideas are coming out there. People are like, hey, we these Enlightenment ideas are being violated. You have people's natural rights of life, liberty, and property being violated. You have people like Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Adams who are starting to show these Enlightenment ideas as they mature. You have this idea of deism where people are basically saying, look, God created the earth and then he just sort of wound it up and lets us do our thing. Um, and so we need to defend our rights, basically. um, God set the rules and allow us to make choices, and we believe that this is the best choice for us. You have rationalism that's also being used in this, where reason outweighs just spiritual blindness, if you will, or religious blindness. You had the Social Contract by John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which basically says, look, if your government is becoming too oppressive and doesn't help the people live a good life, you have the right to rebel. And so that's all coming into to a head here. And then you have right at the end here Thomas Paine, who writes probably the most influential document of the revolution, um, except maybe the Declaration of Independence itself, right? But he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And Common Sense is basically his way of saying it's time to break all ties with British monarch and we need to become an independent state. He argues that it's contrary to common sense for a large continent like the Americas, okay, to be ruled by a small and distant island, and for people to pledge allegiance to a king whose government was corrupt and whose laws were unreasonable. So the pamphlet, because they have the ability to print, of course, is going to spread like wildfire throughout the colonists, and we're going to see more of a divide between the loyalists and the patriots, which is definitely going to set the stage for a revolution in the next webcast. So go ahead and write your summary, and we'll discuss when we return. Thanks.